All right, so let's see what I've covered this year. All right, the beginning of the American government, the Constitution, all the amendments, political parties, special interest groups, economics. And now that they took their state test in government, maybe I can teach some things that aren't in the standards. Let's see. What do students typically want to talk about every year that we really never get time to?
Build that wall! Build that wall!
Our voices raise walls!
Our voices raise walls!
No hate! No fear! Immigrants are welcome!
That's it. Immigration. Wait a second, do you actually want to teach about this? Okay, yes, students do bring up the topic of immigration a lot, but think about what happens in your classroom every time immigration's brought up. Hang on, wait a second. None of them are in my class, it's all online. You idiot, they can't turn your class into a war zone if they're not in your class. Plus, immigration talks about economics, which we just got done with, and it's gonna kind of preview what we're gonna get into next, which is different regions of the world and international relations. Let's do it. See, so I guess there are some positives to online learning. It's a heck of a lot easier to talk about controversial topics. All right, so immigration's a pretty cool topic because all of us are products of immigration. For example, my family's been here in the United States for a very long time. They immigrated here in 1624 as indentured servants from England. Immigration is cool because not only does it make up who we are as a nation, but it also makes up who you are, even down to your physical characteristics. And I mean, here's the crazy thing, like you may not even exist if one person way back when in your family line wasn't able to move from one region of the world to another and meet their future spouse. So immigration helps make up our nation's DNA and your actual DNA too. Back a couple years ago when things were a little normal, I actually did an Ancestry.com unit at the very end of the year where I would teach students how to look at government census records and start building their family tree. And we would actually have a map on the board where students could come up and place a little sticky note on the country where their family was from. Some people found some surprises and some people found some really cool stories about how and why their ancestors immigrated to the United States. Even if you don't know it, your family history probably has an interesting story about why your family left and came to the United States. Could have been for economic opportunities in the United States or back then in the colonies, depending on how far back you go, or it could have been to flee persecution or war in their home country. And in some really tragic cases, coming here wasn't a choice at all. But hopefully I've convinced you immigration is a topic worth diving into and discussing and taking a look at. My goal is by the end of this week's lesson, I want you to have a better idea of what different immigration policies people propose. And I want you to be able to shift through the different arguments for and against each, what the pros and cons are, so that you can better defend the immigration policy that you support. Some of you might even change your mind on immigration after this. Some of you may not have even given this whole topic much thought. But as many of you grow older and make friends with immigrants, compete against immigrants for jobs, maybe even hire immigrants, have immigrants as professors in college, and share in the different cultural traditions that are brought over by immigrants, you'll eventually be forced to have some sort of an opinion on the matter. So ultimately, immigration policy can be summed up into three broad categories, each with kind of different degrees to it. And the first one we're going to take a look at is called closed borders. Now, a country with a closed borders policy allows very little to no immigration at all into the country. And in some nations with closed borders, they don't really allow people to leave either. Even people coming there to work have to work on a very strict work permit. Folks that are in favor of closed borders often argue that it helps keep your culture pure by keeping other cultures that may be bad out. And it also keeps maybe some bad faith actors, people wishing to do your nation harm, from getting into your country. And it also helps protect your citizens from having immigrants come and potentially take their jobs. Now, opponents of closed borders argue that keeping out people from your country can sometimes prevent people from coming in and bringing innovative ideas and new ideas or beneficial things that can help your country. And so they'll often point to a lot of the beneficial things that immigrants bring over when they also bring their culture with them that have become staples of United States culture. And they also point to some of the ideas that immigrants have brought over. Some of those things even turning into weapons of mass destruction than in world wars. Opponents of closed borders also point to the fact that if you're not going to let anyone in, who's to say you're going to let anyone out? I mean, just think about the Soviet Union when they put up the Berlin Berlin Wall during the Cold War. Any traffic coming into East Germany was heavily regulated and carefully watched. But on the flip side, if you wanted to leave and go to the West, you couldn't. Okay, well, technically you could, but it was really difficult, if not impossible, to actually do it legally. People would literally risk their lives to try to make it to West Berlin, and the guards would often shoot them if they tried to cross the border. No, not because they were trying to get in, but because they were trying to leave and escape. Probably the closest example we'd have of a closed borders system today would be North Korea, which is kind of like an isolated hermit kingdom. Seriously, just about the entire nation is surrounded by border walls and fences and armed guards. Anyone trying to force themselves in or out is often captured or shot. Now, in the grand scheme of the world's immigration policies, closed border policies are pretty rare. What is probably the most common immigration policy is called semi-open border policy. In nations with semi-open borders, there's often quotas or a set number of people that are allowed to come over from a certain nation to your country. Then there are multiple hurdles someone has to go over before they come over. If they want to come over to a country to work, they may have to apply for a work visa or a work permit. They may have to get a medical examination, and then they have to pass a background check. Now, if someone wants to come over and live and work permanently in a country and become a citizen, then they'll have to do all those steps I just previously mentioned, plus they'll have to pass a citizenship test. Citizenship tests often ask the applicants to answer basic questions about that nation's government, what their values are, their history, etc. The United States has a citizenship test as well, and I often give that test to my students to see how they would do on it, and I kid you not, this is not me speaking in hyperbole. Every year, it has a 90% failure rate. Yeah, that's right, 90% of my students, if given the test to become a citizen of the United States as an immigrant, would fail it. They'd be kicked out and sent back to their home country. What's that? Oh, you think you could pass it? All right, well, here's the link to it. Go ahead and give it a try if you want. Speaking of the United States, if someone wants to live and work permanently in the United States, they're often going to need to apply for what's called a green card. And unless you win a green card in the green card lottery, which, yes, is exactly what it sounds like, you've got to go through an application process, and that can be pretty hard to do sometimes. So in countries with semi-open borders like the United States, there's a moderate amount of border security. There are some parts of the border that have big fences and walls and checkpoints with guards and patrolmen that try to check people coming into the border and stop them and make sure that they're not bringing anything in illegal or that they themselves are not coming in illegally. But it's not on the scale of closed border countries like North Korea. In the United States, for example, there are still some parts of the country that don't have much, if any, border security at all. The proponents of semi-open borders argue that this is the perfect middle ground because it still allows people in, but it does it in a way that tries to keep people and the entire nation as a whole safe. Opponents of semi-open borders argue that this is an immigration policy with an identity crisis. If it's semi-open, that means you're still likely going to have some bad apples slip through from time to time. And what's to stop some bad actors from trying to sneak through those parts of the borders that you aren't patrolling or don't have walled up? Those that support closed borders obviously criticize semi-open borders and say it's not secure enough. We got to secure the whole thing.
Build that wall! Build that wall!
And then there's open borders proponents, which argue that this semi-open system doesn't do enough to tap into the immense economic and cultural benefits that would come with opening up the nation to more immigration. So speaking of open borders, let's go ahead and take a look at this. Open borders is the idea that people should be able to live and work wherever they want so long as they're not trespassing on someone's private property. With open borders, there's little to no border security along the border, hence the term open borders. Now, there's actually some real-life examples of open borders today. Like, for example, we have open borders between states within the United States. Here, you're free to go visit, to go work, or to go live in any of these states without getting stopped and checked at the border. Amongst European countries that are part of the European Union, they've tried to copy that model, where you can go in between the countries without having to be stopped at the border. And these are sometimes referred to as frictionless borders. Now, proponents of open borders argue that there would be a massive boost to the world economy if everyone opened up their borders and allowed free immigration. That seems kind of outrageous, but here's their arguments for why they think that would happen. And they point to the fact that some people are trapped in regions of the world where they just can't make much money or produce much, whether that be due to the climate or due to the government putting undue restrictions on them, or maybe just violence in the area. So the idea is, if you have someone trapped in poverty in Haiti and you allowed them to move to the United States very easily, then they would be able to produce and actually have money to spend, which would benefit not only our economy, but also benefit them too. So the argument there is that an immigrant immigrant who has maybe even a minimum wage job in the United States is better off than when they were trapped in poverty and couldn't really produce anything for the world to consume. Now that they have a minimum wage job in the United States, they're contributing by helping produce goods and services that we use, and they're also earning more money that they can then turn around and spend and help the economy, which helps all of us. The secret to mass consumption is mass production, and if you have more workers, then you can produce more. One of the big arguments that open borders proponents face from those who support semi-open or closed borders is that just allowing anyone into the country means you could open yourself up to getting harmed by terrorists. Open borders advocates try to counter that by pointing to the statistics that show just how rare it is that you would get attacked or even harmed by a foreign-born immigrant. According to the statistics, you have a better chance of being killed by lightning, by a lawnmower, by falling out of bed in the morning, by getting hit by a bus, and you have a better chance of being killed by armed toddlers. Open border proponents also point to the fact that native-born Americans have higher crime rates than even foreign-born immigrants do. Many open borders advocates also have an underlying moral argument that's behind their policy stance. The moral argument basically says that if someone wants to move to the United States and there's someone in the United States willing to give them a job or even lease out their property for them to live on, who are you to get in between that immigrant and the people that are willing to do that stuff for them? Philosophy professor from Colorado University, Michael Huemer, illustrated this argument in a scenario. And I'll try to illustrate his illustration with my awful stick figures. Okay, so meet Jack here. Jack has just lost his job. He's only got a few dollars left and he is starving. On top of that, the country that Jack lives in has been stricken by famine and war, but he can see across the border in the country next to him, there are plenty of marketplaces with food and lots of bread. So Jack comes up with a brilliant idea. He's gonna go travel to the marketplace and buy some bread for himself so that he doesn't die. Okay, so on Jack's way to the marketplace, he stopped by a guy we'll call Bill, and Bill is clearly aware of Jack's situation. But Bill essentially stops Jack, detains him, and prevents him from going to the marketplace. So Jack is turned away and he can't really find food anywhere else and he ends up dying of starvation. Okay, philosophical question here. Is Bill morally to blame for Jack's death? Now, Bill, in his own defense, is likely going to say, it wasn't my fault he was starving, and there's a moral distinction there between killing someone and letting them die. All right, so that's kind of true. I mean, it wasn't Bill's fault that Jack was starving, but he did kind of stop him from saving himself, and that is Bill's fault. Now, maybe Bill's going to hit us with an economic argument and say, hey, Jack entering the marketplace would have caused demand for food to go up, and that would have caused prices to go up, which would have hurt everyone, including Bill himself. But doesn't Jack have just as much of a right to buy food as anyone else? I mean, if the farmer at the marketplace is willing to sell it to him and Jack is willing to pay for it, does Bill have a right to stick a gun in his face and prevent both of them from engaging in that transaction? Bill might also argue that if Jack crossed over, he'd be trespassing, but Bill doesn't own the whole marketplace, and he definitely doesn't own the entire country that Jack's trying to get into. Now, if the country Jack was trying to get into was like the United States, it probably would have had a mixed economy, which means there would have been some private businesses as well as some public businesses. And if Jack was trying to buy bread from, say, like a Kroger, well, Kroger's a private business. And if Kroger was willing to have him on the property and to sell him the food, who is Bill to get in between that? Who is Bill to say that it's trespassing? He doesn't own Kroger, nor does he own Walmart or Meijer or Target. You can't tell someone they're trespassing when they're on someone's property and that person wants them on their property, unless that country doesn't have private property and everything's owned by the collective society as a whole, in which case it sounds kind of like... Now, before you say, the United States isn't like the Soviet Union, well, this stuff does still happen in democracies too. In 1939, there was a ship called the MS St. Louis, which was carrying over 900 Jewish refugees that were trying to flee Nazi persecution in Europe. The ship tried to stop at numerous countries, including the United States, but was turned away by all of them. Most of the Jews on that boat ended up dying in Nazi concentration camps during the Holocaust. Unfortunately, stories like that sometimes show you that xenophobia, fear of strangers or people that are different than you, or racism can play a role in immigration policy. So stories and illustrations like these are often what proponents of open borders will go to whenever they're making their case that we should really open up immigration. Now, opponents of open borders will not only point to the security argument that you just can't have open borders and let anyone come through, but they'll also argue that having a welfare state and free immigration is a recipe for disaster. And when we're talking about the welfare state, we're talking about things like Social Security, Medicare, food stamps, unemployment benefits, etc. Basically, government benefits paid for via taxpayer dollar. They argue that since immigrants haven't paid as much in taxes into the system, they shouldn't get all the benefits and rewards that the system has to offer. They would kind of be like free riders in a sense. I mean, you can't just have people walking in and taking your country's wealth and then turning around and walking out without paying for it. And opponents of open borders worry that if you have a generous welfare state with a social safety net that promises not to let people go hungry or be without money, then everyone in the entire world is going to want to come to your country, and that's going to strain the system and cause the whole thing to collapse, and that's going to hurt everyone, including those who had paid into the system. Even Nobel Prize winning economist Milton Friedman said you cannot simultaneously have free immigration and a welfare state. That's why some nations like the United States will put immigrants on a waiting list where they have to pay taxes for 10 or so years before they can start receiving benefits. So as you can see, with all three of these immigration policy proposals, there's a lot of different pros and cons. And hopefully you were better able to understand the arguments behind each of these policy proposals when it comes to immigration. Ultimately, my hope is that you're better able to figure out where you stand on this issue. Now, since you're taking the government EOC this week, I'm going to lighten your workload a little bit. You just got this ed puzzle and then one other ed puzzle on the economics of immigration. That's a crash course video, and those are your only 2 assignments for this week. If you're really interested in the topic of immigration and you want to dive in deeper into these arguments, because this video really only scratched the surface of it all, I'll post a few links here to some different sources that you can take a look at that go deeper into the immigration topic on all of these different policy proposals. And depending on when you're watching this ed puzzle, some of you may have already taken the government EOC, in which case I hope it went well. If you haven't taken the government EOC yet, I hope it goes well. Make sure you take a look at some of the review material I posted last week and do your best, not only for yourself, do it for me too. As always, reach out if you need anything and have a great week.